The day the police dragged Karen away in handcuffs, the whole neighborhood watched in stunned silence. What began as petty complaints about chickens and fence colors ended with criminal charges, all because the HOA president picked a fight with the wrong farmer. This is the story of how a quiet man, armed with his grandfather's legacy and a century-old law, turned a suburban tyrant's vendetta into her own downfall, and why no one should ever underestimate a farmer who knows how to fight back. The barn's weathered wood felt like my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, urging me to stand my ground. His spirit lived in every beam and board, whispering, "Keep fighting." I owed it to him, to my family, and to the land itself. I never planned on fighting a battle the moment I inherited this land. My grandfather had always spoken of the farm as a sanctuary, a place where the world slowed down enough to appreciate early morning dew on the grass and the gentle clucking of hens. He taught me to respect the animals and the fields alike, saying that every seed you plant carries a bit of hope for the future. When he passed, I promised I'd keep his dream alive. But from the day I arrived, Karen, the self-appointed president for life of the HOA, seemed to believe her power extended beyond the neat rows of suburban houses and right onto my acreage. She was convinced that my family's farm clashed with the bland uniformity of beige facades and manicured lawns. From the moment our eyes met across the property line, I sensed a storm brewing. In the beginning, it was almost laughable. Letters in my mailbox scolding me about fence styles. Petty demands for me to neutralize the barn's color scheme, as if painting it beige would somehow make my cows more palatable to her. Then came the endless complaints. The scent of freshly turned soil offended her delicate nostrils. The gentle lowing of cows in the distance ruined her peaceful mornings. And even the silhouette of my silo at sunset ruined the skyline of her suburban paradise. I tried to brush it off. Honestly, I had more important things to worry about, like making sure my animals were fed, watered, and healthy, or ensuring the soil was rotated properly for the next planting. The land itself required near-constant attention, and I was too busy to get tangled in petty squabbles. But Karen escalated faster than I could keep up. She circulated petitions among HOA members, demanding the removal of my livestock. She claimed my roosters crowing at dawn was tantamount to noise pollution. It didn't matter that my roosters were kept hundreds of yards away from the nearest house, and that most neighbors admitted they never heard a peep. Before long, city inspectors started showing up. They'd look around, check my zoning permits, and leave with shrugs of confusion. Everything about my operation was legal. My heart would pound whenever I saw another official truck approach, but the relief after each inspection cleared me was always short-lived. Karen would just find a new angle. She questioned the legality of selling produce at the local farmer's market, insisting it turned my quaint little farm into a commercial enterprise that had no place near her meticulously groomed neighborhood. One cloudy morning, I returned from feeding the chickens to find yet another official notice pinned to my fence, another complaint lodged by Karen, this time about obstructing the neighborhood's scenic view. I stood there, reading the words, as the wind rustled the nearby fields, frustration simmering in my gut. My farmland wasn't part of her HOA, but she acted like I was a rebellious child who refused to follow her rules. She wanted control, and I represented a corner of the world she couldn't tame. Finally, the day came when she called the cops, claiming my farm was an illegal operation. Sirens cut through the stillness of the morning, and I stepped out of the barn to see 2 police cruisers in my driveway. Karen hovered behind them, tapping her foot, her arms crossed in triumph. It was hard not to laugh at the absurdity, but my nerves wouldn't let me. I'd heard enough horror stories of legitimate businesses being bogged down in legal red tape, all thanks to frivolous complaints. I was determined not to become one of them. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, trying to sound casual even though my pulse was racing. One officer, tall with a firm jaw, said, "We received a complaint about illegal livestock and zoning violations." I glanced at Karen. She wore a look that screamed victory. "Mrs. Davis," I greeted her with forced politeness. "I see you're as busy as ever." She sniffed. "This farm is a nuisance. The HOA wants it gone." The officer gave her a measured look. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the county records. This land is zoned for agriculture. The HOA has no authority here." Karen snapped open a folder of printouts. "Oh, you'll want to look at these. He's been running a full-blown commercial business, selling produce, eggs, even dairy. That's illegal in our residential community." I sighed, folding my arms. "It's called farming. We've been here long before any of these houses were built." The officer began flipping through her documents, and I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Karen had done her homework, twisting normal farm operations into something nefarious. Then, as if scripted by fate, a black SUV rolled up. Its tinted windows lowered just enough for the driver to confirm something with the police. Karen's face fell when she realized this newcomer wasn't here to champion her cause, but to end it. Out stepped Mr. Leland, an official with the state's Agricultural Protection Bureau. "Good morning," he said to the officers. "We received a tip about harassment directed at a legally protected farm." Karen bristled. "Harassment? I'm protecting the neighborhood from him." Ignoring her outburst, Leland surveyed the property. He took Karen's paperwork from the officer, scanning it with a stoic expression. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Carter, do you have documentation confirming your status as a recognized agricultural entity?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "All filed with the county, up to date." Leland nodded. "Ms. Davis," he said, shifting his gaze, "are you aware of the Right to Farm Act? This farm predates the surrounding residential area, which grants it certain protections against nuisance complaints and conflicting ordinances." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's ridiculous. We have rules for a reason." "Indeed," Leland answered calmly. "We also have rules that protect farms from malicious interference. Based on the complaints we've seen, it appears you've repeatedly attempted to undermine a lawful agricultural operation. That could expose you and your HOA to civil penalties or worse," she spluttered, jabbing a finger in my direction. "He's the menace here. My neighbors and I have to endure the smell of animals, the racket of machinery, and the eyesore of his barn." By then, a small group of neighbors had congregated, attracted by the commotion. Some looked on with sympathy for me. Others just seemed eager for the latest drama. The officers exchanged a glance that suggested they'd had enough. Leland carefully handed the paperwork back. "If you continue filing false reports or harassing Mr. Carter, the state will pursue action. My department doesn't take these matters lightly." Karen's eyes blazed. "You can't do this. You can't all just gang up on me." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, we strongly suggest you cease all interference. If you don't, we will have to take further steps." She stormed off, cursing under her breath about conspiracies and bribes. I watched her retreat, half expecting her to whip out her phone and dial some higher authority. Leland gave me a nod. "Contact us if there's more trouble." For a brief moment I savored the victory. Then I spotted the neighbors, some clapping, others shaking their heads at Karen's vanishing figure. One older woman, Mrs. Carter, no relation to me, said softly, "I'm so sorry you've had to deal with all this." I thanked her and went back to feeding the goats, thinking maybe this was finally the end. But Karen wasn't done digging her own grave. Over the next few days, she lurked around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, eyeing my farm like it was a fortress she planned to siege. Rumors spread that she was combing through old county archives, desperate to find any technicality she could exploit. I tried to keep my head down, focusing on my chores, yet there was always this tension, like a thundercloud on the horizon. Then, on a particularly still morning, I saw her on the sidewalk talking to a group of neighbors. She was waving her arms and pointing toward my property. I couldn't hear her words, but her expression spoke volumes of outrage and desperation. Whatever new plan she concocted, I was sure it involved more calls to the authorities. I mentally prepared myself for the onslaught. Sure enough, the police arrived again, but this time, they weren't asking questions about my farm. They wanted Karen. Apparently, her flurry of complaints had triggered a deeper investigation. Financial records of the HOA came into question. One officer explained that the county clerk's office had flagged irregularities in how funds were handled. Some neighbors complained of never receiving detailed statements, while others claimed they were being overcharged for minor infractions. Karen, it seemed, had been using her position of power not just to terrorize me, but to line her own pockets or at least handle funds in a way that raised eyebrows. I emerged from the barn to see a cluster of police cars in front of Karen's house. She stood on her lawn, wild-eyed, insisting she was the victim of a grand conspiracy. "I called you here to arrest him," she shrieked, pointing at me. "Why are you talking to me about finances?" One of the officers, looking exasperated, replied, "Ma'am, we have reason to believe you've engaged in fraudulent activity within the HOA. We also have multiple reports of you falsifying complaints against a protected farm. We need you to come in for questioning." She tried to deflect, calling for the neighbors to rally around her. "He's destroying our property values. Don't just stand there. Help me." But her audience was unmoved. The same neighbors she'd bullied with rules about trash can placement and lawn ornament restrictions seemed only too glad to remain silent. That's when Mr. Reynolds, a usually quiet resident, spoke up. "Karen, we're done. You've fined people for having their grass half an inch too long. You've called the cops on kids playing ball in the street, and now this? We're sick of living under your thumb." Karen's sputtering turned incoherent as officers took her by the arm. She clutched a clipboard that shook with her trembling grip. "This is my neighborhood," she screamed. "I'm the president." For the first time, Karen looked small. Her clipboard clattered to the ground as the cuffs clicked, a sound sweeter than any rooster's crow. She glared at me with all the venom she could muster. "You ruined everything." I stood firm, recalling my grandfather's lessons about standing up for what was right. "No, Karen," I said quietly. "You did that all by yourself." The police escorted her to the cruiser, ignoring her continued protests. Neighbors broke into applause, not a jubilant celebration, but more a collective sigh of relief. Freed from the oppression of Karen's petty regime, they finally felt they could breathe. When the cars pulled away, Mr. Leland appeared once again, having observed the entire spectacle. He shook his head slowly. "Some folks just don't know when to quit." I gave a humorless chuckle. "No, they really don't." He extended his hand. "If you have any more trouble, but I have a feeling she'll be tied up in legal matters for quite some time." With Karen gone, the neighborhood atmosphere changed almost overnight. People waved at me over the fence. Some even came by to buy fresh eggs and produce, admitting they were too intimidated before. The new interim HOA president sent a polite letter explaining they had no interest in interfering with the farm, and that they hoped to foster a more inclusive community spirit going forward. I found I could sleep better, no longer worried about surprise inspections or bogus police calls. The roosters still crowed at dawn, but their cries felt like a victory anthem now. I poured my energy back into the land, turning soil, planting seeds, mending fences, tasks that, though physically demanding, brought a sense of fulfillment. The nights felt peaceful, with only the distant rustle of wind through the crops and the occasional lowing of cattle under the moonlight. Of course, Karen's downfall spread through local gossip like wildfire. Word was she faced significant fines and potential criminal charges for misappropriating HOA funds, forging documents, and filing false reports. A few neighbors mentioned potential civil suits as well, since she'd used HOA money to wage personal vendettas. In the end, her determination to crush my farm ended up crushing her own authority. Sometimes I'd walk the perimeter of my fields at sunset, letting the long rays of golden light wash over the rows of vegetables. Each season brought its own set of challenges and rewards, far more important than the trivial demands of a meddling neighbor. I thought about my grandfather often, feeling his presence in the soft soil beneath my feet, and in the crow of the roosters at dawn. The land was still mine, still ours, and it would stay that way. Looking back, the entire saga seemed both surreal and inevitable. Karen was the kind of person who believed rules existed to serve her interests, not the common good. She disregarded the farm's history, the Right to Farm Act, and even the wishes of many neighbors in pursuit of her personal vision of suburban order. The irony was that her relentless quest for control ended with her own humiliation, while the farm remained as steadfast as ever. Ultimately, what this taught me was simple. Never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right, especially when you know the law is on your side. Farming is more than just a livelihood. It's a legacy, a connection to the earth that can't be severed by petty bureaucracy or the whims of a tyrannical HOA president. The sweat and toil of my grandfather, my father, and now me, had cultivated something enduring and beautiful. Karen's paper threats and unending complaints were no match for generations of honest labor and the legal protections designed to shield it. Now I still wake at the crack of dawn, heading to the barn with a sense of renewal rather than dread. My animals greet me with their usual calls, each sound a reminder that life goes on, season after season. The new HOA leadership keeps a respectful distance, focusing on maintaining the neighborhood without overstepping their bounds. Occasionally, I share surplus produce with grateful neighbors, a small token of appreciation for those who quietly supported me through the ordeal. As the seasons cycle, I'm reminded that no matter how fierce the storm, the land endures. My farm, anchored by tradition and nurtured by time, has weathered far worse than a belligerent HOA. And as for Karen, she lost the power she'd clung to so tightly. But in a strange way, I hope she finds some peace too. Maybe she'll realize that trying to uproot a farm that predates her suburb was a battle she was destined to lose from the start. Because in the end, a farm isn't just a piece of real estate, it's a testament to perseverance, love for the land, and respect for the natural rhythms of life. It's a monument to the families who came before, and a promise to future generations who will till the same soil. And no matter how many forms or complaints someone files, you can't erase that legacy. Not while people like me, and laws like the Right to Farm Act, stand ready to protect it. So that's how Karen's war on my chickens ended with her in handcuffs. And that, I suppose, is the lesson. Never mess with a farmer who understands their rights. Because if you do, you might just find yourself on the wrong side of the fence and the law. After Karen's arrest, I stood in the barn at dusk, letting my thoughts wander. The air smelled of straw and old wood, just as it had when I was a kid trailing my grandfather's boots. Sometimes I could almost hear his voice telling me to check the feed troughs or lay fresh bedding for the goats. Fighting legal battles hadn't been on my mind back then. I worried about leaky roofs or the next storm rolling in. Yet my grandfather's grin whenever he displayed a fresh harvest kept me anchored. He believed farming was a promise to the land, one you never broke. Karen had tried to bury that promise under petty rules, but her ploys felt hollow against decades of devotion. One evening, I walked the perimeter of the property, just like my grandfather taught me. Each fence post and trench told a story. The orchard grafted for sweeter fruit, the rows painstakingly plowed by hand. This land's legacy stretched back through generations, far beyond any suburban rulebook. The sun drenched the fields in gold, the chickens clucked in their coop, and the cows strolled quietly toward the pasture gate. In that peaceful scene, the idea of an HOA president dictating how I should farm felt laughable. The earth had already chosen its side. I stopped under an old oak tree at the corner of the property, its leaves rustling in the breeze. Leaning against its trunk, I silently thanked my grandfather. His spirit lived in every seed and beam of this farm. Karen's downfall proved one thing: when you stand up for land this deeply rooted, no bully can tear it away.